Okay, so hello everyone. It's nice to see everyone again. Some new people from last week. So welcome to the second workshop on more than human collaborations in geographical research, which has been organised by myself, Jenny Dodsworth, and Lauren Van Patter, with support from the Vital Geographies Research Group at Cambridge and the Lives of Animals Research Group at York University in Canada. I'm Johnny. I'm a third year PhD candidate. And I've been thinking through collaboration in relation to my fieldwork with dogs and wolves in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Those of you who joined last week would have seen the first two panels on modes, motives, and methods for more than human collaborations. Amongst other things, Anindya Sinha spoke about macaques in Indian cities and the relationships that emerged between street sellers and monkeys and how they might be viewed as collaborative endeavours, where the human-animal relationship is fundamental to survival in the multi-species city. Anna Lawrence then gave a wonderful talk in which she challenged the notions of plants being merely the background to a world filled with more lively and charismatic animals and other objects. Vegetal collaboration, she posited, involved rethinking our ontological assumptions regarding plants and plant intelligence and finding new ways to appropriately story the ways plants contribute to social worlds. That was the first session on modes and motives for collaboration, and after that we had Emma Rowe, Bill Adams and Mara Miele talk about various methods for collaboration. Emma Rowe discussed various approaches in her own research where she has attempted to invite or entertain the non-human into knowledge-generating practices as collaborators or participants in the research process. Bill Adams then talked to us about GPS tracking elephants and the role of elephant agency in generating knowledge about elephant worlds. Here, concerns were raised as to what extent these technologies are used on rather than with animals, and therefore to what extent we can consider this process to be collaborative. Finally, Mara Miele discussed her recent research concerning dog trainers and the relationship between dogs and humans in the training process. She also discussed the visual methods she deployed that have helped gain an insight into dog worlds in terms of collaboration. These talks were followed by a lively discussion where, amongst other things, attention was brought to the distinction between human and non-human collaborations that are reciprocal in the case of Rana's macaques versus those collaborations that are less voluntary in the case of radio-collared elephants. I hope that refreshes everyone and brings them up to speed a little bit. So I'm now going to hand over to Lauren, who's going to introduce the themes of today, and then to Jenny, who's going to go through some of the technical aspects and the running order.
Great, thanks, Johnny. So I'm Lauren Van Patter, a doctoral candidate in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University in Canada. I work with the Lives of Animals Research Group, and I've been thinking about collaboration in the context of human interactions with urban coyotes. I'm coming to you today from Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Anishinaabe peoples. In addition to acknowledging the land, I just also wanted to say that last week there was some discussion about Indigenous ontologies and approaches to kinship and the way that these might or might not align with broader discussions around more than human geographies and collaboration. And so I think continuing this conversation and dialogue around decolonizing post-human thought is really important and maybe something that will come up in the final discussion today. So this week's workshop has two parts. First, we're going to have our final panel on ethics of more than human collaboration and imagining collaborative futures. Here, our three panelists will reflect on some of the opportunities, challenges, and ethical considerations in thinking of more than humans as collaborators in various pursuits. And then after our short break, we're lucky to have Dr. Clara Mancini delivering a keynote on the topic of collaboration in animal-computer interactions. And we'll also be joined by Drs. Beth Greenhow and Alice Havorka as discussants. And then we're going to open things up for final questions and a wrap-up discussion on any of the topics from last week or today. And Jenny is going to tell you a little bit more about the technology and logistics.
Thanks, lovely. Okay, so I'm Jenny. I'm a PhD student in cultural geography at the University of Oxford. Given the number of participants who are attending these sessions, we've made a mural board, which is an online interactive whiteboard, where you can outline your questions and discussions for the panelists or contribute to the wider discussion. And we hope that this will give everyone an opportunity to express their views and provide a sort of generative visual aid for the discussion. We hope it went quite well last week and you're all still willing to engage with trying this platform again today. We also just wanted to remind you that the call is being recorded for those who couldn't attend today or last week, and that we'll send the links to the Zoom recordings for both sessions once we've uploaded them to our research cluster websites. My own interest in more than human collaboration stems from a long existing interest in participatory techniques as they are utilised in rural landscapes, and as part of my PhD research I've been looking at the ways in which both farming communities and their sheep can have their perspectives of landscape brought to the attention of the broader public through visual social media. I'm now just going to briefly introduce the Mural platform, where we encourage you to post your questions and comments. Of course, if you do have any trouble with this, please just post them in the Zoom chat and we'll move them across for you. Mural's best opened on Google Chrome or in Firefox if you have these. It can be a little bit stilted in Internet Explorer. So I'm just going to share the screen just to briefly introduce that to you all again. So I hope here everyone can see the Mural platform. We'll send you the link momentarily as well to this. There is a small section for each of the panels or discussions today, and you can already see some of the sort of generative discussion that we had last week up here. To make a comment on the board, all you need to do is zoom in using either your mouse or your trackpad on your laptop. Simply double click and then you can zoom in and create your comment. If you do see a comment or a question that you'd really like to see answered and you think it has some purchase, you can also use one of these stars that we've placed at the bottom of the panel sections and just simply drag and drop that next to the question that you want to see answered, so that we can see their kind of upvotes on particular questions that people really want to hear more about. If you do have any problems with the platform, do feel free to just send me a message on Zoom and I'll help you out as best I can. I'm just going to stop sharing now and hand you back to Johnny.
Thanks very much, Jenny. So the final part of the two workshops is on the broad theme of collaborative ethics and imagining collaborative futures. Speakers were prompted with questions such as how can or should researchers negotiate dynamics of beliefs, boundaries, encounter, and representation when engaging in more than human collaborations? What opportunities or challenges for engagement, care, and responsibility emerge? How do these impact the lives of more than humans we work with? And how are alternate and emergent ontologies and technologies shaping opportunities for more than human collaborations? In this panel, we have Phil Howell from the University of Cambridge, Adam Searle from the University of Cambridge, and Clemens Driessen from Wageningen University. Our first speaker today is Phil. So please feel free to share your screen and welcome.
Thanks very much. It's going to take a while. I think I've got it. Can you see that screen? I should go back to the beginning, shouldn't I? Oh, sorry. Excuse me. I've got the wrong thing up. My apologies. Sorry about that, Johnny.
No worries, no worries. Take your time.
Lauren, do you have this on to hand?
Yep, I can bring it up and you can just let me know.
If I could. I'm sorry to be so inept, but I have so many screens up.
No worries at all. Here, let me just share it. There. Can folks see that all right?
Thanks very much, Lauren. So sorry to be inept.
No.
And sort of apologies slightly. I'm going to go somewhat off message, although I'll focus on the sort of challenges of doing this kind of research more than anything else. I was listening to Rana's wonderful talk last week, and a bit later on, I said to Rana, I don't know what I'm going to talk about exactly, and he was very encouraging. But anyway, this is slightly hastily cobbled together, and if you the title I'll sort of explain. This is sort of rather sort of oblique and cryptic, but if you go to the first slide, and this is a really terrible strategy for this kind of thing, to spend time talking about what I don't want to talk about. But if I had any sense at all, I would talk about some work that I have carried out with my graduate student, Ilana Tavares, really thinking about the collaboration of Black Lives Matter protesters and horses in the BLM and racial justice protests of last summer. And here, for instance, is an amazing woman, Brianna Noble, on her horse Dapper Dan, riding to the Oakland protest at the beginning of June last year. And as I say, this is a really, really terrible strategy. But because I gave a talk about this not so long ago, I felt I didn't want to rehearse it. If anyone's interested in this paper, I'm very, very happy to pass it on. If anyone knows, well, if anyone knows Tim Cresswell, I'd quite like, Ilana and I have submitted this to a journal, and anyway, a while back. And anyway, if you do know Tim, sort of pressure him to get this refereed, that would be nice. But this is perfect for this, because actually this, the work that Ilana and I did was thinking about the way in which horses can be collaborators in the negative sense. We don't use that terminology, but they can be collaborators with, for instance, state violence. The man on horseback, it is typically a man, is a figure of authority and violence, and the very phrase "man on horseback" has been used as a sort of a shorthand for thinking about state violence and military power, even in democratic civil societies. So there's collaboration in this sense, but there's also collaboration in a more positive and progressive sense, because men and women like Brianna Noble have they have worked with their horses to provide, in a very media savvy way, to provide an alternative focus to the BLM protest, knowing full well that the media will zero in on this spectacle of protesters on horseback. And if you go to the next slide, here is another. Here is a woman called Kiara Wade, part of a group, an urban trail riding group, you know, really sort of making opportunities for underprivileged and typically non-white people to get involved in the culture of horse riding and caring for horses. And as Kiara Wade says, these horses feel whatever we feel, and they're hurting right now because we're hurting right now too. And there's so much love and unity within the Black cowboy and cowgirl community. We're just trying to bring that energy to these marches in a peaceful way. So there's an obvious sense in which that sort of collaboration, Ilana and I talk about it as a kind of political dressage, you know, a sort of way in which the discipline and the training associated with working with animals can be seen in a, you know, a more positive way, not just a kind of a Foucauldian discipline, but a sort of collaboration in the way that Mara Miela talked about last week, and people like Donna Haraway have talked about. So there's that. And after spending 5 minutes on that, I'm just going to leave it there. And I feel a bit like a spectre at the feast, because I'm actually going to concentrate on on being more cautious about the kind of stories we tell. I'm thinking about what Lauren said at the beginning of this session, thinking about more than human storytelling, and thinking about collaboration as resistance. And I just want to sort of flag up the fact that this kind of storytelling isn't easy, and there are some problems associated with it. Methodologically, but also I think ethically and politically. And I'm sort of interested in this photo of Chiara Wade, who is excellent. But the framing of this photo it's straight down the face of this animal, and it's very much focused on Chiara herself. And I think, you know, in some ways, without wanting to be super critical, in some ways that makes me think about the difficulties involved in this kind of storytelling. So if you could move to the next slide, and sorry, Lauren, I've been lecturing about the Windrush generation and the ways in which the 1948 Windrush, the arrival of passengers on the SS Windrush, is the beginning of sort of mass non-wise migration to Britain. Not necessarily immigration, because the passengers, the vast majority, had every right to move to the UK. And I started thinking about the ways in which there might be a story to be told about the relationship of these migrants with animals. And here are a couple of, this is a paired set of images by an artist called Harold Dearden, painted in the 1950s. And they show, as the title suggests, a Caribbean family feeding the pigeons in Trafalgar Square. And actually its paired painting is a group of Indian women in Trafalgar Square. And I'm thinking about particularly the Caribbean family and the fact that these birds are also kind of migrants. The journey of the rock dove to the urban pigeon, to the despised urban pigeon, seen as, you know, seen particularly as vermin and sort of chased out of Trafalgar Square, is interesting to me. And it seems to me there is a potential for thinking about the ways in which people and non-human animals can be figured in the same ways. And in a not terribly organized way, that made me think about the Trinidadian novelist Sam Selvon. Next slide, please, Lauren. Thank you for doing this. And Sam Selvon has written many excellent books, and this is very much minor literature, but he's an important post-colonial voice in Anglophone literature, post-war Anglophone literature. 3 of his novels have been recently republished by Penguin, and the most famous of which is certainly The Lonely Londoners, which documents the lives of West Indian migrants to London in that Windrush period. Next slide, please. And I'm thinking about the ways in which we might imagine these books as, in terms of the narrative analysis notion of story worlds, the story space, which is a sort of collaboration between reader and author. And it allows us, narrative analysis call this a deictic shift. It means that the reader is taken to a different place and a different set of values and ideas. No time to really talk about in any great detail, but Erin James has thought about the ways in which an ideal and implied audience of non-Black British readers in the 1950s and 1960s are really sort of challenged with imagining what it's like to be a migrant from this background. So this fits into post-colonial criticism. And I want to extend this really to thinking about what I'm thinking about is multi-species story worlds. More than human story worlds for sure, but multi-species story worlds. And I sort of like this particular cover of one of the books in this series. And it's a terrible idea talking about texts with which very few people will be familiar. It's like talking about your dreams or your travel photos. Nothing could be duller. So I hope you'll forgive me, but you'll just have to take my word for it that the sort of referencing to a sort of multi-species metropolis is definitely there. And I'll give you some examples. Next slide, please. So these are just the sort of general feeling from people like Aaron James is that these books document the challenges faced by migrants from the Commonwealth. And Lonely Londoners doesn't sound like a sort of fun read, but they're comic novels. They're very interesting. They're very well written. They have dated in some difficult ways, particularly in their sexual politics, and indeed in their language and their representation of people from different ethnic communities. But they are kind of fun. And in one instance, one character in The Lonely Londoners, a man called Henry Oliver, who's known as Galahad, is so hungry that he decides he's going to catch a pigeon and eat it, which is not a sort of British thing to do, but it is something that he wants to do anyway. And he chases this pigeon, catches a pigeon, and is immediately sort of seen by a British resident British woman who thinks that, you know, he's being cruel to animals, despite wearing a fur coat and leading around a little dog. There's a lot of fun to be had between sort of British norms in relation to animals and the mores of these migrants. "You cruel monster, you killer," she shouts out, and Galahad blood run cold. He sees the gallows before him right way, and he pushed the pigeon in his jacket pocket and stand up, and the pigeon's still fluttering in his pocket. "I must find a policeman," the woman screeched. That's just one little episode. Next slide, please. In the book, The Housing Lark, which revolves around the desire of these migrants to find a place to live, there's a character called Nobby who is in a house, and in a complicated way, he ends up being given a dog because his landlady presumes him to be an animal lover. And as this quotation suggests, Nobby knows that if he say no, he might as well start to look for another place to live. So he ends up with this dog that he doesn't want and ends up sort of selling it down the pub. And anyway, comic pathos ensues. But what you've got here, as you'll see from the second quotation here, is a kind of, it's a riff on Kipling, and east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. Here, it's the only thing is dog and man is man, and never the twain shall meet. And in the Caribbean, the culture of dogs is very different. Dogs aren't cosseted, they're not mollycoddled, they're not treated in the same way that UK, British people would treat them. And third slide, please. I realize I have to finish relatively soon. And in a book called Moses Ascending, Moses Alouetta, who's the sort of thread character, and two of these books are in his narration, or he is the central character, and the narrator uses him as a focalizer. He comes across two of his tenants in the house that he now owns, Fazul and Farouk, who are Pakistani migrants. And anyway, he sees them slaughter a sheep. He sees them guide a sheep and slaughter it in halal fashion so that they can eat. And I won't read it out, but he remarks on the fact that you don't hear, you know, you hear some animal noises, but you don't hear sheep bleating very often. And this is a sort of, all of these things are about the sort of confrontation of these new migrants with a different kind of culture relating to animals, different kind of mores. And there's a lot of irony, there's a lot of parody, there's a lot of comedy that comes from that. However, if I can go to the last slide, the final slide, when we get to some forms of criticism where this is noticed at all, it is in a pretty sort of drab and inadequate sense. Huggan and Tiffin's Post-Colonial Criticism is a very, very good textbook, but the sheep episode, for instance, in Moses Ascending, all it amounts to for Huggan and Tiffin is the hypocrisy of the West in condemning animal slaughter in an age of agribusiness and the industrial destruction of farm animals. And this seems to me sort of deeply inadequate in thinking about the ways in which Selvin should be understood. It feels a bit like sort of off-the-shelf criticism, or sort of what I would call sort of pret-a-porter politics, you know, in a sense that, you know, here's what we expect to find, and this is all that they can say about this particular episode. And I've used the, I'm trespassing on your goodwill a little bit, but instead of just so stories, the kind of Kipling idea of, you know, how the leopard gained its spots and all the rest of it, and the ways in which, Stephen Jay Gould complains about just so stories in evolutionary biology as sort of functionalist and teleological. I'm gonna flip these round and see whether so just stories flies. And by so just stories, I mean sort of rather quick and easy and but deeply simplistic narratives. So just I like because it's the inversion of just so, but you will see a kind of allusion to social justice stories. And I'm a little bit concerned that, you know, ethically, methodologically, and the like, that we sort of take storytelling that's pertinent to thinking about the more than human world, and we take storytelling that's pertinent to decolonizing and post-colonial and colonial, the colonial present, and we push them together, and we come up with a sort of identity of interest between the animals, the non-human animals, and the interest of the people involved. I'll probably leave it there because I think I've sort of stuck to 15 minutes. And I'm happy to, obviously happy to take questions. Forgive me for being very, for interpreting the brief very widely, Johnny, but that's what I would say. If I stuck to BLM and horseback riding, it would fit perfectly, but just to be perverse, I've decided to do something sort of different and a little less comfortable, I think, in this particular context. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. There's so much there, from the horseback stuff to the storying, and the storying definitely didn't go off track. This is definitely something that we've been thinking about ourselves as part of Modern Human Collaborations. To keep with the time, I think there's probably there's time now for one question, and then we can definitely come back and I'll let people ask you more direct questions right at the end in the discussion and also on the mural board. So if anyone has a burning question before we move on to Adam, then please ask now.
There is a question in the mural that's popped up. I don't know if the author wants to ask it in a little more detail, but what are the differences between political dressage and normal dressage? What do the horses gain from these relations / collaborations? I don't know who the author of that particular question was, if you want to make yourself known.
That was mine, so I was going to just leave that one. But
Foucault himself uses the word dressage for thinking about the kind of disciplinary power, the training of the body, which may or may not be for more positive or more sinister reasons, but it's a kind of imposition, an inscription on the body. And we know from people like Donna Haraway and others that there are, and Paul Patton speaking about horses, that there's a more positive spin that can be put on training. And Mara actually talked about this last time. Mm-hmm. So here, it's a kind of reclamation of dressage and a reminder that sort of, I'm going to say horsewomanship in this case, is a sort of working with these horses. And these are, in Brianna Noble's case, these are rescue horses. So she's having to work really hard to bring these horses back to rescue them and actually, with them, play a role in actually reclaiming people's lives. Not just in a political sense, but in a more, she runs something called the Humble Project, which extends opportunities to people who wouldn't otherwise have that entry into what is still a very white world of horse keeping and horsemanship. So there's a lot of care being extended. I knew I should have gone with that. But
I mean, it sounds fantastic. I would love to read the paper. It sounds really brilliant. And
please do. I've got to. I'm sorry. I don't want to get at Tim Cresswell, but it has been in there since September. I sent it to a journal. So Ilana and I worked on this. And anyway, if it doesn't get placed there, then try somewhere else. But if anybody's interested, I'm very happy to pass it on.
So thank you very much, Phil. That's brilliant. I think now is the time to move on to Adam Searle from the University of Cambridge. So please feel free to share your screen.
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
The slides, yeah. Okay, so just before I start, just say a huge thank you to Jenny, Lauren, and Johnny for putting together this event. I really had a great time last week, and thanks a lot for Phil for that really provocative, interesting, brilliant presentation. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, my PhD project, but also kind of attend to one of the questions that was set in the kind of spec of the event description. So my research is basically concerns the changing meanings of extinction in a world where cryo and biotechnologies are ever more commonplace. In effect, I examined how these changed meanings, or purported changed meanings, influence the politics of ecological restoration projects and conservation in the anthropocene. This photo here in April 2018, which feels like a very long time ago now. And this was the first time I visited the Department of Animal Production in the Aragonese Center for Agricultural Research. It's in the industrial outskirts of Zaragoza, which is the state capital of Aragon in northern Spain. And without context, this probably seems a bit strange and just a photo of a sign, but I couldn't take photos inside when I was there. But actually, a series of experiments took place here in the early 2000s and again in 2014, which attempted to reverse Ricardo. And I guess what happened here, and the non-human animals that were implicated and kind of forced, this research was forced upon in the name of scientific breakthrough, raises a plethora of issues concerning the ethics of more than human collaboration, and also the imagined futures of de-extinction, or a world where extinction is a kind of malleable ontology. So this is the bucardo, the animal that I spoke about, that I've spent the last 3 years researching. It's sometimes called the Pyrenean ibex. And this animal was once endemic to the whole Pyrenean mountains that separate Spain and France. And its habitat had once spanned from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. However, centuries of overhunting for meat and later sport meant that by the turn of the 20th century, only around 10 individuals remained alive in the valley of Odessa in the Spanish Pyrenees. And hunting continued even after it was banned, and a national park was founded in order to preserve what remained of its habitat in 1918. However, this wasn't successful, and the last bucardo died in 2000 on the 6th of January when the last animal was crushed to death by a falling fir tree. And I'm not really going to go into the conservation histories or the extinction history here, as I don't really have time, and I thought I'd just rather pick up one of the questions set by the spec of the event, which I thought was really, really interesting, which is how are alternate and emergent ontologies and technologies shaping opportunities for more than human collaborations? And I thought it was like just a really interesting question to pose to my research and ask questions that I hadn't really asked myself about my research before. So just to break it up a little bit, that bit in the middle about emergent ontologies and technologies, that was really interesting. So more on the bucardo here. 8 months before the last bucardo died in Odessa, she was trapped and a biopsy was performed in order to preserve her genetic material. What the scientist told me was to save her genome. And this material was cryogenically preserved and set aside for speculative futures of de-extinction. And this meant when the last bucardo died, it became the first taxon to ever be outlived by their own intact cells, because when an organism dies, cells start to decay, and then they're kind of unsuitable for cloning. But what this did is shifted the ethical considerations of the Bucardo's extinction as an event. It changed the ontological realities of it. It had a kind of technologically mediated liminal space in between complete extinction and extant. And I should say here, I'm using media representations as photographs because I didn't want to use personal archive photos from my research participants here. But actually, what's interesting, actually, when I went to kind of get these media representations up in the Spanish press, is that the headlines are talking about the Bucardo being cloned. There's always this speculative future, and I think it changed the kind of material reality and the politics of the extinction itself, and kind of depoliticized it in a way, distracted from the cause of the extinction, which was overhunting. Yeah, and then looking at the technologies and knowledges at work in what then came was the kind of first de-extinction, if you want to call it that, which is how it's often referred to in the press. And to get to this point, a range of crossbreeding methods were needed in order to create surrogate mother who had the ideal gestation period to carry a Bucardo embryo to pregnancy. So domestic goats were good for having pregnancies in captivity, but they had a pregnancy length that was too short. But Iberian ibex, which is a different taxon to the Bucardo from central Spain, were more suited for it, but couldn't be kept in captivity. So then the scientists in Zaragoza had to purpose breed many domestic goats with wild ibex, rendering these animals, these individuals, as kind of experimental vessels for scientific breakthrough. And there's a whole assemblage of like technological apparatus and knowledges at play here. And this ended up in the production of 497 Bucardo embryos, 57 of which were transferred to recipient surrogates with a pregnancy rate of 12%. However, only one pregnancy reached full term to a surrogate mother of a hybrid wild domestic goat. And it was the first time an animal had carried the developing embryo of an extinct taxon. Then what you see here is the C-section in 2003, which was a Bucardo clone being delivered by C-section on the 30th of July, 2003. In the words of the scientific report here that was published in 2009, quite a bit later, was the delivered kid was genetically identical to the Bucardo, disregarding the influences of mitochondrial DNA from the oocyte of the domestic donor of the domestic donor and the uterine environment of the hybrid recipient, end quote. And here there's a glaring contradiction in this account in that the delivered kid was therefore not identical to the Bucardo. There was a medley of hybridities going on. And autopsies of the clones, sorry, I don't know if I didn't say this yet, but the clone died sadly after 7 minutes. It lived a very grim, short life. And autopsies confirmed that one of the lungs hadn't developed properly, so it wasn't able to breathe. So that the toll on the animal is really quite stark, but it was celebrated quite widely in certain communities as a success, a breakthrough. And the project, the funding got cut for the project due to a range of political reasons and didn't restart until 2014. But these were just a few of the emergent ontologies and technologies that were rethinking extinction as a permanent state, and they raise a whole range of ethical questions. But another part of the question that I found equally interesting was this bit about collaborations, and what the Bucardo case highlights as equally problematic. Collaborating. Because for me, collaboration is mutually consented agreement, yet the toll on these experimental animals of de-extinction is not collaborative. The labor forced upon the surrogate mothers is coercive. It's kind of non-human labor that Manbarrow calls the emergence of form. Donna Haraway calls emergent ways of fleshy becoming, or Lloyd Waquan calls bodily labor. And actually, in all the media representations and scientific work on the Bucardo's cloning, the surrogate mothers are completely written out from the story. The mother of the clone was euthanized after the C-section. That's not spoken about. And even the surrogate who carried the clone and wasn't named in any of these accounts yet. Names of both the clone and the unwilling donor of the genetic material are both enshrined in imaginaries of the animal and the representations of it. So up to now, sorry, getting towards the end here, but just up to now, this has kind of just been an ethical critique of de-extinction science, which is nothing that new or hardly a positive thing to think about going forward, or how to speculate upon it and think about more human research and collaboration. But anyway, I just want to take you to the French Pyrenees here. And on the left here is a photo I took during participatory observation work in 2019. And And you can see a group of people here walking over to boxes in the middle of the valley. And inside these boxes are Iberian ibex, translocated from the center of Spain, from a mountain range near Madrid. And on the right here is a photo from the French press last year of translocated ibex in the Pyrenees. And what I propose here is thinking about processes of ecological restoration as a form of collaboration. And although the original translocated animals were coerced into the move, they were trapped, they were captured, and they were moved. There is an ongoing collaborative effort now with the subsequent generations to repopulate the Pyrenees with ibex. Obviously, they were captured and taken away from their habitats, which raises ethical issues. But the ecologists I spoke to said they actively tried to mitigate these by translocating social groups. Normally, these ibex grouped together in groups of 3, 4, 5. And when they did translocations, they'd kind of try and target these groups. So not only to reduce stress to the animals that were moved there, but also to translocate the social relations of these animals to the Pyrenees. Yeah, and there's still a biopolitics here, but I think it more falls under like the ontological framings of like the rewilding movement, in that it embraces agencies and self-governance of the ecological systems themselves. And the animals aren't buccardo, but they look quite similar, and they're in the habitat where they should be, where buccardos should be. And the restoration project was tried to start in the 1980s, but it never materialized because of really like harsh opposition in Spain, and it was opposed by many who felt the animal would be invasive to the Pyrenees, or that they would not in winters, or that they felt that a future cloning project was the only way that they could maintain the genetic purity of a buccardo intact for the Pyrenees. But as I said before, that the cloning wasn't a genetically pure buccardo anyway, so that argument is quite flawed. And yeah, the success of this project has been quite immense. Last year, 60 kids were born in the Pyrenees, and there are now over 400 in the Pyrenees. And one of the cloning scientists told me themselves that this kind of gets rid of any sort of justification for a future cloning project. And I guess just returning to this question as a kind of loose conclusion, speculative conclusion, that considering the ethics of cloning as a form of biotic recovery or de-extinction shows that such Promethean dreams of a world without extinction are fundamentally flawed in their unjust exertions of labor and stress on other animals. I think when people speak about mammoth, when people who really into de-extinction speak about mammoth de-extinction, they hardly ever talk about the elephants, the endangered species that are going to be experimented on in order for this to come about. And this is coerced labor, the coerced labor of the surrogates, and the bodily material, it's a case of the buccardo anyway, is conveniently disregarded in these accounts. And I think it's because they don't want to flag these ethical issues. But I find in the case of the Iberian ibex, in the footsteps of the buccardo and in its habitat, are a response to these emergent ontologies and technologies. They actively question and in many instances invalidate the justifications for de-extinction in the form of cloning. And they offer hope for alternative means of conviviality in an age of extinction, hope that doesn't get swept up into this quick fix technological wizardry of de-extinction. Sorry, I've gone over by about a minute there. I apologize, but that's me.
Thank you very much. It's super interesting. Again, so much to think about there in terms of coercive labor and different scales of collaboration or not. I'm just going to open up straight away for questions. I think there's one here on the mural, which I'm going to ask first, unless the person who wrote it would like to read it. Okay, so it says, is the case of the ibex a case for letting die, not neglectfully, but carefully, and in acknowledgement of the real costs, for example, forced reproduction, of making live? So is the case of the ibex a case for letting die, not neglectfully, but carefully, and in acknowledgement of the real costs of making live?
That's a great question. I suppose it's kind of, I don't have an easy answer to that. I think it embraces a sort of mourning process. Yeah, that's a more careful way of remembering the buccardo. A lot of the ecologists I speak to say that this pays homage to the extinct animal in a much better way than an animal born in a laboratory would be. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
And then we've got a comment here in the on Zoom from Emma Rowe, who says there's parallels with some work she's been doing with Sarah Perez, studying animals in the lab where the same techniques are used, where they're trying to write the labors of animals into the practice and process. And then there's a question underneath as well, which is, what work have you found useful to create an ontology that can include all these other bodies in the making of life? Sorry, Emma, I just saw you pop up there on the camera as well.
Yeah, it's very similar. I mean, obviously, the techniques that we're studying have been taken out to do some of the work with species that are becoming extinct. So I just it's really interesting to hear if you've got any more details about what kinds of ontologies you found are really useful to include all these, like the mothers that basically just get culled, but because we have whole litters of mice that then get culled, and it's turned my orientation away from the ethics of taking life towards the ethics of making life.
I don't really have an answer to that question. Sorry. Do you have a what? I mean, do you have a suggestion? That's really interesting. I'd like to.
Yeah, well, I guess we're just trying to write using our research data to try and bring attention to, within the animal research world, it's referred to as surplus animals, essentially. But surplus animals are just kind of culled and disposed of. Although we do find that there's a pet industry for the reptile industry, where some of the ones that aren't genetically altered can go into becoming pet food. So we're trying to look at some of these alternative routes, but ultimately it's a process of culling the unnecessary animals in a litter. So yeah, I mean, I feel at the moment we're just in the kind of deep in the empirical side of it, but it's interesting that there's been so much written about the taking of animal lives. And obviously, ultimately, the taking of animal life is still incorporated into this process, but it's very much there at the making of lives, where there hasn't been as much emphasis. And I guess when you're talking about the making of particular strains of mice that are going to be used in research, or in your case, working on creating animals that are about to become extinct, there's so much onus on the attention to the making of those lives. The focus goes entirely on those, and very little is said about the wider ethics of who is being brought into that collaboration of making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fascinating point. It brings to mind also other instances of making lives and the kind of recent development of technologies to raise male surplus animals from certain industrial practices like cows, which is what I've done some research on in India, and the male chicks, of course, are in the chicken industry come to mind there as well. Thank you very much, Adam. If there's any other, there's points on the mural, some of which are quite broad, so we can come back to in the discussion at the end. So I think to keep time, I think we'll move on to Clemens Driessen.
Thank you, Johnny and Jenny and Lauren, for inviting me, for having me here in virtual Cambridge, I guess. And let me see if I can pull off this crucial move nowadays. Let's see. Yes, indeed, as I expected. All right, is this kind of visible and clear? All right, thank you. Yeah, what a great set of questions you're putting forward. I guess like Phil, I hope that whatever I'm going to throw at you now kind of meets this questions that you were thinking of. A very interesting range of concerns that I'm not sure I'm fully grappled with, but let's see. So there's the question of ethics. I thought just spell out a bit what I thought were your pointers. There's the questions of ethics, perhaps in animal or modern human geographies, and in a way you could consider that as something that you know, relates to how we deal with actual animals in tricky situations that I also tend to study, whether in conservation, as Adam just showed, or in farms, or in labs, or in zoos. And at the same time, there's of course all these theoretical debates and conceptual commitments, and I'm always, of course, really interested also in how these relate and how ethics is both in both these, let's say, in our concepts and in the ways we engage with animals. And then there's this question of collaboration, which suggests perhaps labor on the part of animals, which is of course a very interesting theme, but which also raises the questions whether it is our projects that we ask them to collaborate in, whether it's their projects perhaps, or can projects somehow be shared. And with the idea of project, I think also this notion of futures comes into play that I've been trying to grapple with. The question to what extent non-humans relate to what we call the future, how we can think or situate animals in time, for instance, through concepts such as care, love, and play. I've gotten really interested in how these notions may function in a kind of temporal dimension. But I'll get to that. Lauren mentioned the question of indigenous ontologies, of decolonizing, well, our thought, our practices, our institutions. And I think for today, I want to try a particular approach, not so much to be inspired by indigenous ontologies only, but also there's I feel another route as well that could be productive, and that is what you could call provincializing modernity, or to see how, let's say, the modern ontologies that need to be decolonized originate in particular experiences and in particular more than human geographies. It is kind of a proposal. I'm happy to eager to hear your thoughts on this. And I just, by courtesy of Adam, I just stole his slide. I hope he agrees to this. Because I think it sets it up in a great way. How do we relate to alternate and emergent ontologies, technologies shaping opportunities for more than human collaboration? I thought that would be a really fun interjection here as well, to see where I'm going to take this. Because I'm going to take this to the 1580s, where we have Michel de Montaigne sitting in his castle outside of Bordeaux, watching birds come in. And he writes about in his essays, one interesting passage in his many essays, the Apology for Raymond Sebon, which is the longest essay, which deals extensively with animals and human-animal relations. And here he describes the swallows that we see at the return of spring, searching all the corners of our houses for the most commodious places wherein to build their nests. Do they seek without judgment, and amongst 1,000 choose out the most proper for their purpose without discretion? And in that elegant and admirable contexture of their buildings, can birds rather make choice of a square figure than a round, or an obtuse or than of a right angle, without knowing their properties and effects? So he asks in kind of cognitive sense about what these birds, what these swallows are doing when they're building these clay nests, and it's in cognitive terms, but also in terms of care. Do they mat their palace with moss or down without foreseeing that their tender young will lie more safe and easy? So there's the question of foresight. There's the question of what birds in a way are thinking or doing in building a nest. And this is perhaps a way to claim this also, well, in a way to claim these essays as a new writing technology. That's something that I'll briefly mention in a bit, but also how to look at these nests as speculations, right? And here you can see in this passage and in others that for Montaigne, knowledge of the world was something shared between animals and humans, right? And in many ways, humans are picking up things from the animals that they look at. Swallows have educated humans how to build. Nightingales told us about music. Other animals showed us medicinal plants. So there's there's this sense of more than human knowledge throughout. And this also resonates, this idea of the nest and what happens in the making of these nests resonates with what Vincent Desprez has argued about these nests. They are, in the making of the nest, where one bird starts and another one, decides to couple up, depending on, the aesthetics of the nest that was emerging. These nests are objects that captivate, transform, and produce beings that fall in love, or that they enamor, fascinate, and have an effect on them. So here, Desprez sort of, explores these different types of terms to describe what goes on in the process of emergence of two birds, perhaps three, and the nest that they are building and that they are mutually shaping. All right, so that's a way of looking at nests. Then Montaigne goes on to, for instance, describe how cranes, the question of cranes and looking at birds' flight, that was of course a classical way of where humans try to divine, try to develop foresight of futures. And he asked the question: Do these cranes actually participate in these divinations? Do they, to what extent is it actually sensible to look at animal movement, of course, when you want to attune to their prospective abilities in the way they relate to seasonal changes. And this final bit from Montaigne, the famous quotation of, where he asked basically this question: when I play with my cat, how do I know that she's not passing time with me rather than I with her? Where we entertain each other with reciprocal monkey tricks. If I have my time to begin or to refuse, so has she hers. So there's this idea of who's playing with who, but also this emphasis on the question of time, on this question of the temporality of these interactions, of who's initiating and who's responding, and what is the meaning of these responses. And I think in these examples, you see Montaigne sort of exploring through the genre of the essay that he invented here. He's exploring these ways of asking questions that do not assume a kind of very confident human with exclusively human traits, right? He's constantly putting himself at stake in these questions of how to look at animals. And then to make a half a century jump into the 1637, I guess, with Descartes' publication of his Discours de la Méthode. Here's the villain of modernity, of course, where everything went wrong in the way we look at nature, I guess you could argue. But it's interesting, like I said, to kind of look at the very concrete experiences and the environments in which Descartes was developing his ideas of the dualism of mind and body, and the idea of animals as being deep down mechanical. So this is a scene where he's looking at an owl and a couple of birds. The biggest one on the right is singing. Is singing a tune, but suddenly stops whenever the owl on the left turns around, and whenever facing the bird, and whenever the owl turns away again, the bird on the right, perhaps the nightingale, starts singing again. Now this scene and scenes similar like that, Descartes saw just when he finished his school and went to the Garden of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and he describes in various moments where he argues that animals truly are mechanical. He refers to his experiences in these gardens of so-called garden automatons. So the scene I just described, this is from a book of a garden fountain and garden automaton designer, Salomon de Caux. Descartes decides that, okay, whenever I see these moving and seemingly singing birds, I should be deeply suspicious, because underneath there is mechanism. So this is, in a sense, the illustration of that. So in his days, so in the 50 years since Montaigne, these classic geometrical gardens had been filled with these kind of whirring machines, automatons, that miraculously produced movements and sounds and dynamics, which created this, which instilled this sense of nature as mechanical, you could argue. And then he writes explicitly, and this is one of the few well, philosophers that he actually quotes in his works here in a letter, where he explicitly says, "I cannot share the opinion of Montaigne and others who attribute understanding or thought to animals. Doubtless, when the swallows come in spring, they operate like clocks." Right? There's this sense of the clock, the automaton, as how we should understand animals and how we should understand their deterministic behaviors. All right, I'm going to skip 3.5 centuries now in view of the time, and look at contemporary ways or contemporary sort of debates in ethology, biology, on the question of, and that's how it's very often framed, how animals, the question of whether animals travel in time, whether they can do mental time travel, whether they have the ability to picture themselves in future situations. Now there's several, a number of different ways, conceptualizations of this view, but what is interesting, I think, is this distinction, or this sense of relating to the future, being in time as a mental thing. A few key examples: the Swedish zoo chimp that gathers stones in the morning to throw at visitors in the afternoon, and ravens that have been found to similarly have a kind of flexible planning for tool use and bartering, so they prepare tools to use later. And as these headlines show, this is showing human traits that we claim. And it's interesting, I think, this idea of animals relating to the future, our sense, are key questions of do they actually do that? Do they have a sense of the future that is conceived of as this mental ability? It's purely mental ability, and in terms of abstract causal reasoning, as opposed to this more responsive, supposedly solely responsive and responding associative learning. In short, I think in relation to these questions, to these scientific concepts being deployed today, we can ask this question: what is the environment in which we look at animals? Are we in a way designing Cartesian spaces for soulless mechanical causation, or are we creating Montaigne's world brimming with life and love and creativity? And so that is kind of like maybe a bit too dualist, maybe a bit too romantic versus mechanical. So I wanted to briefly sort of revisit a very old project of mine where, together with a number of designers and a number of pigs, we tried to create an interactive setup in a way to stage this encounter between humans and pigs. And indeed, the kind of questions that to ask in these situations and the kind of concepts to use proved, at least in my experience, crucial in thinking this through, and in trying to create situations in which you're not sure who is initiating and who is responding, where you're not sure who is playing with who, and to create this kind of, well, here's the kind of setup where the interaction design or the interface design became something that animals participated in to some extent. We felt, is it collaboration? We felt it was somehow confirming their interest in what we were doing, but at the same time, it was interesting to, I think, to see how notions such as play and curiosity, these kind of notions that imply this kind of temporal relation to the world, played out quite significantly in our in this situation. And I think I'm probably way over time, so I'll probably stop here. And I'm very curious whether this made sense as a response to also the beautiful slide that I stole from Adam.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much. That definitely made a lot of sense. I think I hope that Clara Mancini can talk a little bit more later about this stuff with designing with pigs for various reasons and stuff. And I saw in the press yesterday, I think there was a story about pigs being trained to play a video game or something like this as well. So yeah, there's lots of stuff resonates there. So thank you very much. Does anyone have any immediate questions for Clemens? If not, there's a good question. I think it's by Joshua Evans on the mural board. Joshua, do you want to read that yourself or?
Sure, yeah. I just wrote, so thanks Clemens for your talk. I was interested in the sort of relationship that you're drawing out a bit between play and work. And I wondered a bit more about how this relates to collaboration. Because of course, you know, as has been talked about by others, also collaboration certainly has some kind of relation with work, but I wondered whether it holds to the same degree as having a relationship with play. And so I wrote here on the board that, you know, the symmetry of consent that Montaigne describes in playing with this cat may certainly be true in play, but is it also true in work? If the human has a plan for the non-human, the former may not always let the latter object or choose to leave in the same way that play perhaps by definition requires. And so I wondered if maybe you could reflect a bit on, yeah, whether, you know, whether it's sort of in some way fully honest to use play as a model for collaboration, where the former is kind of by definition not goal-oriented, where the latter perhaps is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Joshua. That's a great question. And indeed, play is this very, very elusive thing. I guess in a way, what we were trying to achieve is kind of it was work in a way. It was a project to create play, but thereby the play that we wanted to create was not fully defined as. And there's this great book by Sutton Smith called The Ambiguities of Play, which kind of goes through elaborate ways of the many ways in which play is this elusive and ambiguous thing, and thereby I think it was work to try and find this relationship of play, but thereby it wasn't a clear goal we defined at the outset. We were very eager to kind of be shaped in that, and eventually gave up because we felt we didn't achieve it enough. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm looking at the mural board as well, and so Lauren's written a comment here.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just, you know, this sort of relates to the previous discussion too, but I think this interesting question of temporality and futures, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about the connection you see between the temporality and collaboration. Does it, you know, require a future orientation in terms of projects or things?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, it was indeed something that I was thinking, that there is a sense of collaboration where I guess it's often assumed that, you know, it's a human project and we ask the animals to collaborate, and that sort of the humans do the mental time traveling to envision this future situation, and the animals, you know, respond or not to whatever is presented to them. And I wanted to explore that, and maybe also I think these types of notions that imply a certain dynamic relation to time, to futures such as play or curiosity, or care, as in the birds making this nest, they suggest a kind of disruption of, you know, the mental time travel, where we have the blueprint of this future condition and we just need to figure out a way to get there, and towards more a kind of ongoing process of adjusting and of seeing when something is right, sort of in the process of doing something. So I guess there's this sense of, perhaps there's this ideal of collaboration, as in Vincient's Desprez description of making a nest together, where to really collaborate, you kind of become this new thing, this couple with nest.
Great, thanks so much.
Emma's written a question in the chat and on the mural as well. Would you like to read that out?
Yeah, thanks, Clemens. Have you thought about the changing cultures of curiosity towards animals and how this relates to responding and recognizing their behavior as curious?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess this you know, shift, in a way, this historical shift between Montaigne and Descartes, you could see as a changing culture of curiosity, but then sort of, in a way, lower or yeah, directing the curiosity towards anatomy and mechanical causality, which does not expect much curiosity from the animals to originate in or via the animals. So it would be interesting to look at this, to see whether we, you know, broad swaths of humans in contemporary cultures talk about animals in terms of their curiosity. And I know that is a term that is often used by the intensive pig farmers that we were working with, and so they were very much used that term to describe behavior of pigs to explore, and whenever there's a one-way gate, they would take it. That was the sense.
Mm. Thanks.
There's lots of comments here now on the mural page. So I'm gonna invite one more to Clemens before opening it up wider. I think Diane Borden's written a question here. If you would like to. Or it might not be Diane, but I can read it. It says.
Oh, I can also
it is?
do it like, I'm sorry, I was having, I had my camera turned off, you know how you can do the button setting, and I was having a hard time. But yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm such a slow thinker, so I hope you'll forgive me for this. It's more kind of, I'm really curious about, there was a point where you talk about Montaigne's sort of passing time. And one thing that I'm really interested in, I'm working with bees in time currently, and sort of this idea of time making or timekeeping. And so I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts on sort of, you know, what is actually going on here? You know, when we're talking about futures, is this a time making practice? Is this a timekeeping practice? You know, is timekeeping in a way almost too sort of keeping with like capitalist times? I know that this is kind of a disjointed question, so thank you for kind of muddling through with me. But yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on sort of the way that we're kind of thinking through these, both in terms of how we phrase these things and what's actually being kind of co-produced.
Yeah, thank you. That is if that is slow thinking, I'm very scared for your questions on a fast day, but I think I don't know how to respond. But I guess one way is that one of the things that I've been trying to deal with in a way in this question of animals and time is whether, you know, we should think of each species as having their own sort of natural time. Their own, of course, there's seasonal rhythms, there's, you know, experiential time, I guess in some way there's this von Uxküll sense of animals in time, where they see time as passing slowly or quickly, or whether you're a snail or a mosquito. But at the same time, it's, I think, interesting to avoid too much granting sort of each species their own time in which they are kind of, you know, that they, and indeed, as you describe it, it's more interesting to see, I guess, their being in time in a more dynamic way, in a more I don't know if this responds to you at all, but in a way that is yeah, that is less easily to define and really depends on the kind of context and environments, rather than is ingrained or kind of pre-programmed in their organism. Yeah, I hope I'm thinking any quicker than quick enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So just to know, I think we're going to end this session at about 3 p.m. UK time, and then come back at 3:15 for the keynote. But yeah, I'm just going to open up now to wider discussion. So if anyone has any points or would like to read some of their comments out that are up on the mural, then they can feel free. Michael Overton's written a question or a comment in the Zoom chat. Yeah.
Mine was more of a light-hearted remark, really, but I suppose it does speak to the importance of looking at the individual as well as the species when thinking about collaboration. But I'll pass on to someone else.
Okay.
Like in relation to toddlers, I guess it's easier to treat it as play rather than work. But yeah, you won't get much done, I guess.
I wanted to ask a question about consent, if that's okay. I was thinking about it in last week's talks and also throughout today's talks. And I was wondering whether we can ever gain consent from animals, because I think to me it seems like for a research process to be collaborative, then there must be consent with all the people involved, all the people and non-people actors involved in doing the research. But how can we gain consent from non-human beings? I was thinking about Bill last week talked about the elephants, and that was obviously very non-consensual and very coercive. I just wanted to see whether anyone had any thoughts on that.
I think that's a really good point. There was a comment last week around elephants that were coming up to the cameras and looking as if they were kind of interested in being around these technologies and stuff, which I thought was quite provocative. And I know Lauren's done some work on a film like how to gain consent, and I think Beth and Emma have looked at this question as well. I think Mara Miele was, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and one that I've been struggling with or dealing with in my own research, and with Harriet and the team working with me in this dog training research that we're doing. Obviously, these are, very contested sort of issues, but I wonder whether when we talk about consent, is it very much part of the animal geography or critical geography studies or critical animal studies? We look at training or other forms of animal work when non-human animals are involved in working practices. We frame this issue of consent in a very humanistic way. I think, probably we should do an effort, or we should try to or humanize these ideas of consent, if we wanted to get a bit closer, I guess, to the experience of the animals. And I have two issues. I mean, I have no answers, but I have two questions. One is, what is the consent that humans do or give when they get, when they don't choose the point of starting point, when they don't choose to be born in a poor country or in a rich country, when they don't choose to have opportunities to get trained and to do a certain kind of job, to get certain skills or not get certain skills. What is consent at that point, and what is consent for working dogs or horses, as in the example that Phillip was telling us. And I think if you look at how they start to work with, how they establish a relationship, we try to unpack what these relationship, how these bond the relationship in practices of work, how it's made, what is made of, and what are the instances in which you can see, kind of dog way of seeing things or refusing things. And the same very much is, with the research by Linda Burke and many other people working with horses. If we pay attention from a horse or a dog or any other working animal's point of view, I think we can deconstruct how these collaborations are made and what matters in those collaborations, what doesn't matter. And basically we might want to rethink about what consent is about. I'm sure I haven't helped very much in terms of providing answer, but I think it's a sort of strange question that needs to be a bit more complicated.
I'm sure there's some interdisciplinary collaborations that are important there as well for kind of working out what consent might mean for different species. I think a lot of the work being done in animals, geographies, the apostrophe after the S, is collaborating with ethologists and stuff like this with different species to answer some of those questions. But I think that's a super important point.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
It's really interesting, the question about collaboration. I'm sure a lot of people who work in sort of biology of animal behavior would speak about sort of winning, the field craft involved in winning acceptance, sort of the kind of the person who habituates a group of apes, for example, so that you can move with them through the forest, those kind of things, and also attracting. I mean, there's a lot of sort of field craft around offering wild animals certainly something that they want. So there is an element of trade. They come to food, they come to whatever. Not that's generally, I think, collaboration, but it is the way of not so coercively involving or bringing animals into a context where they can be studied, and I suppose that would open up the possibility of more collaborative kinds of relationships. And I still think the question about whether one should think about collaborating with an individual or think about collaborating with groups or indeed species. A lot of biologists don't make that distinction easily, as I said last week. Thanks.
If there's more comments on that, I think if there's no more comments on that, we can look to the mural again. And there's a question for Phil on multi-species storytelling and post-colonial discourse. I wondered if the person who wrote that might want to ask it. If not, it says, could you kindly elaborate on your concern about multi-species storytelling and post-colonial discourse?
Yes, I can try. It's hardly an elaboration because I hardly said anything about it apart from to express my reservations. I was thinking about, there is some really good work, people like Colin Diane, who's written about, read a great book called With Dogs at the Edge of Life, but the geographer Heidi Nass thinking about fighting dogs and bull terriers, and Benedict Boisseron thinking about Creole animals. I think there's been some really interesting sort of pushing together of discussions of animal welfare and animal rights and actually post-colonial situation. I think they're all very good, but you get very close, I think, to saying that, for instance, dog fighting communities, we can't be too far off from thinking that, well, the dogs themselves, that are engaged in dog fighting sort of collaborate with their trainers and their owners in a situation which, with all the hypocrisies that we have from the point of view of the West or outside societies, we see as bad, same as cockfighting and lots of other things. And I think each of these things needs to be thought of in its particular specifics. Hunting groups, hunting societies have always said, well, animals in cosmologies, they collaborate with the hunter, they give themselves up, they offer themselves up. And it's really up to us in the specifics of the situation, I think, to think whether there is a genuine sort of community of interest, or whether actually we fall back on, in some cases, self-serving storytelling. And my concern is that we slip into a kind of rote storytelling, a monologue where, we know who the enemies are, capitalism, colonialism, white privilege, whatever it is. But that doesn't in itself mean that there is a genuine community of interest. What I like about Sam Selvin is that you have this kind of agonism. You have the pigeon doesn't want to be eaten, but there's a sort of interesting clash there. And the sheep doesn't want to be eaten too, I guess, unless in some way there's some interesting manufacturing of consent. But it's a sort of historical and a political and a cultural conjuncture with no super easy, sort of moral to it. And the books are interesting. And actually the flattening out of these things into saying, well, this is an indictment of sort of Western hypocrisy, it sort of makes me sigh, with that sort of world weariness that comes when you reach a certain age. That, is that it? Really? Is that all that we've got to say about, this collision of animal and human interests, different communities, different cultures? It's so much richer than that. And I think the danger is that we get a kind of post-colonial reading and a sort of animal welfare reading that are sandwiched together and made to speak in, if I can borrow Clemens, in a slightly mechanical way. And that's what I'm sort of being grumpy about when I use that phrase, so just stories. It's not to condemn it. I think there are situations, I think the horse stuff is absolutely spot on in lots of ways, but in other respects, we might want to be cautious about ascribing collaboration when actually there is no genuine, in reflection, there is no easy, genuine sort of community of interest there. Yeah, formulaic.
Clemens?
Yeah, maybe to pick up on the consent question. It was a pity that last week Christina Mpumusa could not join because of internet problems in Uganda. But we've collaborated on a recent paper where she, based on her fieldwork in Burundi with mountain gorillas, which kind of describes or tries to engage with the way in which the habituation, the growing numbers of mountain gorillas that are being habituated to humans, how to make sense of that process, and all the competing claims around what goes on in this process of habituation, whether it's indeed a manufacturing of consent to be watched by scientists or by tourists, or whether what goes on in the process is somehow more symmetrical or mutual. And this is a very tough, question in many ways. On the one hand, it's a very elaborate process, this habituation, and in many of the situations where tourists, for instance, meet these animals, the animals are very clearly in charge. At the same time, they have been affected and changed in their behavior. But one of the ways we try to make sense of it is by seeing that at the moment still there are a lot of groups of mountain gorillas in Windy that have not been habituated, and we felt that as long as that is the case, you see a lot of gorillas opting out or shifting group allegiance, and in that sense there is kind of like an opt-out of being a habituated gorilla and moving into a group that is non-habituated. We felt that options, or that geography of choice, perhaps it's too liberal thinking, but at least it generates this sense that there's multiple ways of being a gorilla in that space.
Just a quick note that we're going to have a break between now and 3:15, but everyone's welcome to stay to continue this discussion if they want, or go and get a drink or something like that, or whatever. I'm just going to keep asking questions and continuing the conversation with anyone who wants to stay though, so it's up to you.
Yep, and any that we missed just now, we'll copy down your questions from this panel's mural board to the closing discussion mural board, so the questions will remain to get discussed later.
So, Adam, there's a question on the mural for you. I don't know if you've seen it, or if you know who JMD is. Looking at
you know who JMD is?
Oh, is it you?
Yeah.
I didn't. I was looking for the M as well, and I was like, "Who's that?" sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, Adam, thank you so much for a fascinating paper. Obviously, we have a lot of mutual interest in this area, but I was just curious if you could say any more about the role of any particular landscape imaginaries of sort of what the Pyrenees should look like for local people, for tourists, for other stakeholders, governance structures, in terms of how de-extinction is or should be done, and also how that relates to any broader rewilding agendas that might be taking place in the Pyrenees. I've only done a little work on that myself so far, and I've always been really surprised at the continued importance of things like transhumance and the moving of sheep around the mountains, but also the real issues that they have with sort of land abandonment. In sharp contrast to the work I've done in the Lake District, it seems like it's quite hard for them to keep these animals on the hills up there. So yeah, just if you could comment on that.
Thanks for a great question. Yeah, I think interestingly in the case of the Pyrenees, I like drawing upon like Dolly Jurgensen's work on ecological restoration here. Like there's an idea that there was something missing very much, which drove the restoration project of Iberian ibex to the Pyrenees, which is quite interesting because it's not an endemic animal to that habitat. It was taken there because there was seen as an absence in the landscape, one that needed to be filled. And by filling it, in a sense, they stopped any sort of future cloning projects. But I think in contrast to other issues in the Pyrenees, like kind of, especially in the French Pyrenees, there's a lot of tension around you're either with the park or you're against the park. And it's, I'm sure you've looked at this with farmers, transhumance farmers in like Ariège and areas like that, where there's big projects of reintroducing bears there. And it's like the park becomes this kind of symbol, or like ecological restoration becomes this symbol that is like against local ways of life or ways of being. And I think what the ibex do quite well, and what my research with them has kind of suggested that the success of this project has achieved is because they've kind of been marketed as like a politically neutral one. It's a lot easier to kind of what Dahl Jorgensen speaks about in the context of beavers in Sweden and how it can be constructed as a people's project, and that's a lot easier with a herbivore. And it's done through lots of ways, which I think kind of on the question of the theme about futures, I think this is kind of maintained through a series of outreach projects of the national park, like the local primary schools all name an ibex when it's released, and it's always a big deal that each class has a different ibex in the mountains and they can speak about their ibex. And it's very much, even though this was an animal that never was in the Pyrenees, it's this idea of kind of creating a sense that they're always there, and animals that are completely woven into the cultural landscape of the Pyrenees, like a marmot, for example. Marmots were introduced in the 1950s from the Alps, but they're very much seen as a part of Pyrenean nature. And I think actually it doesn't take long for something to belong or become part of that landscape. Sorry, I don't know if I've really answered the question there.
No, that's great. Yeah, these tensions around ownership and who gets a say, who's involved. I'd be really interested to see how this plays out also in terms of like the larger scale agri-environment contracts and how CAP changes in the next 4 or 5 years as well. And I see so many tensions and interesting points of comparison with the UK case that I'm sure we could witter on about for ages. So I'm going to stop there, but yeah, thank you so much.
I think there's 5 of us left, so I definitely need to have a quick break myself. So continue. I'll be back in a sec.
Can I ask Adam? Is there a sense that some of these de-extincted ibexes are they showing proper behavior, or that in their behaviors are exemplifying what, you know, that they have recovered or that they have re-emerged, or is it basically genetically defined?
That's like one of the most interesting questions that I think is really dependent on the kind of epistemological, I mean, even like the geopolitical situation, where a lot of people about what is I think it brings up an interesting question about what a bucado is, and for certain actors in Spain anyway, it's very much defined through this genetically unique clave that is speciated in the Pyrenees, and a Pyrenean animal that's endemic to the Pyrenees. Whereas with ecologists that I work with in France, this idea of what a bucado is more about an ibex that is big, kind of fatter, with much bigger horns that can survive the winters. And interestingly, already the project started in 2014, and in 6.5 years, the morphological traits have changed kind of quite significantly in the introduced animals. And I've been thinking about this as a sort of form of phenotypic de-extinction, by looking more at the relationship between the genome and the environment, rather than just centering on the genome itself. And what you get is a really interesting shift in what we can define the extinct species as, or what's coming back. And yeah, but lots of like details from ethnographic work with kind of people in France, some of the French ecologists being like, well, they're becoming more and more like bucado every day. And this idea that there's this kind of, I don't know, for me, it completely gets rid of any sort of justification, and with a lot of the scientists themselves, gets rid of any justification for cloning, when there's already, I mean, we're all carrying the genetic material of many extinct beings. The genetic material is there, it's just in a different part, and it's going to be expressed differently. Yeah, I've just rambled on there again, but I think interestingly, at first this was very much seen that only cloning could bring back this animal in Spain, and then what's happened in France has really turned that on its head. And even now, those opinions that were quite harshly against the restoration project in Spain have have shifted and are beginning to shift. And also in the local dialect as well, there's an interesting like thing as well within the local version of Aragonese, which is a really rare language spoken in a few villages in the Pyrenees. They have the same word for these animals, and I think that's kind of, I talk about that in my thesis and I'm writing about it at the moment, that actually it's more about where the animal is and what the animal's doing rather than the kind of lines drawn around it taxonomically.
Nice. Yeah, very nice. Thanks.
This paper looks very, very cool, the gorilla paper.
Yeah, it was, Christine did years of field work of looking at both humans and gorillas in Burundi. And it was very interesting to indeed engage with these kind of questions about are these gorillas consenting, or are they, are they true gorillas or not? So again, there's this, I guess, similar to your situation. There's this really this sense of, okay, what are they supposed to be or do? How to define them? Did you get into that, Phil? With is there an urban horse and a rural horse, or?
Not quite, but it's, of course, horses have been in the city forever, but it's only in more recent times that they've been sort of pushed to the margins or the countryside or the ranches and so on. So, when you're using a word like urban trail riding or urban cowboys, there is a city element to this, of course, but urban, just like, when you think about genres of music, it's very much seen as sort of non-white, non-elite. And, to have these urban trails is a really, really interesting thing. It's not quite my thing. I don't know anything about horses, nor do I really do this kind of contemporary research, but it would be really interesting to see the ways in which these kind of opportunities have been sort of expanded. But it's the paper that Ilana and I wrote is an entirely a sort of secondary thing. I kept meaning to write to people, or encouraging Ilana to write to them to do some interviews, but never quite sort of got around to it. But for sure, you think of cowboys, you think of the frontier, you think of the West, and actually having these sort of human horse hybrids in the city is what's interesting, I think. And what makes it a story. Mm-hmm. Horse riders on the prairie isn't a story. Horse riders in the middle of one of the Los Angeles boulevards or something is a story. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Clemens, is that you were wondering whether the Descartes Montaigne thing was too dualistic, and I sort of thought it was, but only in the sense that there should be a triangulation with the technology aspect. Lots of really interesting stuff on automata, and I don't think it's a choice between mechanical versus natural. I think there's a when you're thinking about the environment and the affordances, including technical affordances and reproductions and all the rest of it, then there is an opportunity to enliven environments and spaces and houses in the way that you described. So Olya Petra and I wrote about birdsong a little bit, just to sort of try to get away from the is it pure, is it natural. The Nightingale doesn't teach us music, but at the same time, musical technology doesn't sort of evacuate birds of their sort of agency. There's a really, really interesting sort of fusion of the two, and it's the sort of collaboration between organic beings and inorganic things and spaces is one of the things we should think about.
Yeah, thanks for that. Maybe to link up to your story. I think Montaigne always claimed that his preferred condition to think was on horseback. So in that sense, there's this combination of him walking around thinking.
Yeah, I read a whole book on the history of automata, the cultural history of the idea that, you know, there's a kind of spirit in the machine. But I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I'll put it in the chat once I've Google scholared the heck out of it, sitting on a shelf. But I just can't remember it off the top of my head, but I'll find it.
Have you looked at Sandra Swartz's history of horses in South Africa, which is also really...
Yes, I've not sort of drawn enough from it, but horse history is amazingly good. Most of it's early modern. That's where all the sort of action is. And, you know, in part to think about, well, you know, the horse doesn't disappear from the city streets because it's used in policing and, you know, even in the sort of relatively peaceful West, the horse is still, the man on horseback or the woman on horseback is still a figure of authority and power, you know, including sort of state violence. Dogs, you know, to go back to Mara's paper, you know, there's training, but dogs could be used with their handlers, you know, they could be used in situations which we don't find at all progressive. So some forms of collaboration might be approved and other forms might be really not. But yeah, there we are.